The diner buzzed with the hum of conversation, the clatter of utensils, and the faint melody of an old jukebox in the corner. It was a modest place, nestled in a quiet corner of town, where regulars found comfort in coffee that was never quite hot enough and pie that was always a little too sweet. Richard Ellis had stopped in only by chance. His schedule was tight, his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, and his mind raced with the problems that came with being one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state. He didn't belong in places like this, not anymore. Yet, something had drawn him in. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the pull of something he couldn't yet explain. He barely looked up as he slid into a booth, tugging his phone from his pocket. Work emails filled the screen, demanding his attention, but as his eyes scanned the menu, something, or someone, caught his attention. A waitress in a simple uniform moved between tables with practiced ease. She smiled warmly at a family with 2 children, refilled an elderly man's coffee without being asked, and offered a kind word to a couple sharing a slice of pie. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet elegance that seemed out of place in the bustling diner. And then Richard's world tilted. His breath hitched in his throat, and his phone slipped from his hand, landing on the table with a muted thud. He stared, unable to look away, as recognition slammed into him like a tidal wave. The waitress, her face, her posture, even the way she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, was unmistakable. It was Anna. But it couldn't be. Anna was gone. 23 years had passed since the love of his life had been ripped away from him, swallowed by the cruel waters of a stormy lake. He had been there, clinging to the shattered remains of their boat, screaming her name into the darkness. Rescuers had pulled him to safety hours later, hypothermic and delirious, but Anna had never been found. Her disappearance had haunted him ever since, a wound that never healed, a ghost that lingered in the corners of his mind. Yet here she was, or someone who looked so much like her that it made his chest ache. He watched as she approached his booth, a notepad in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Her hair, now streaked with hints of gray, was pulled into a loose bun, and her face bore the subtle lines of time. But her eyes, those were the same. Deep, soulful, and filled with a kindness that had once captivated him. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "What can I get you tonight?" For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. His throat felt dry, and his heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to grab her hand, to say her name. But instead, he managed a shaky, "Coffee, please." She nodded, jotting it down without looking up. "Anything else?" "No," he said quickly. "Just coffee." She offered a polite smile, then turned and walked away, leaving Richard to grapple with the impossible reality before him. His mind raced with questions. Was it really Anna? If so, where had she been all these years? Why hadn't she reached out to him? And why was she here, working as a waitress in a small-town diner? When she returned with his coffee, he mustered the courage to speak. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You look familiar. Do I know you?" She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "I don't think so," she said, setting the coffee down in front of him. "I'm Emma. I've lived here for a while. Maybe you've seen me around." "Emma," he repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. It didn't fit. This was Anna. He was sure of it. "Are you certain we've never met before?" Her eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, or maybe fear. But she shook her head. "I don't think so. Enjoy your coffee." And just like that, she was gone, moving to another table and leaving Richard drowning in a sea of emotions. He sipped his coffee absent-mindedly, barely registering the taste. His mind was consumed with memories of Anna, her laugh, her smile, the way she used to hum while painting in her tiny apartment. Those memories had been his refuge for years, the only thing keeping him tethered to the past. But now, seeing her, or someone who looked so much like her, had upended everything. He stayed in the diner long after his coffee had gone cold, watching her from a distance, trying to piece together the puzzle. She moved with the same grace Anna had, spoke with the same gentle tone, and even laughed in a way that tugged at his heart. It had to be her. There was no other explanation. As the diner began to empty, Richard made his move. He stood and approached the counter, where she was wiping down surfaces and organizing receipts. His hands trembled as he placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. "But I need to ask you something." She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something there, something unspoken, something that told him he wasn't imagining things. But then she looked away, her walls firmly back in place. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard's chest tightened. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "If you're Anna, if it's really you. I need to know. I've spent 23 years thinking you were gone. I deserve to know the truth." Her hand froze on the counter, and for a moment, he thought she might crumble. But then she straightened, her expression unreadable. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, her voice colder now. "I'm sorry for whatever loss you've experienced, but I'm not who you think I am." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen and leaving Richard standing there, his heart shattered all over again. As he stepped out into the cool night air, his mind reeled. If it wasn't Anna, then who was she? And if it was Anna, why was she pretending otherwise? The questions burned in his mind, fueling a determination he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't let this go, not this time. He glanced back at the diner one last time, its warm glow spilling out onto the empty street. Somewhere inside, the woman who had once been his entire world was hiding a truth he was determined to uncover. And no matter what it took, he wouldn't stop until he found the answers. Richard drove home that night in a haze, the weight of the encounter pressing on him like a heavy fog. The quiet hum of the engine did little to drown out the cacophony of thoughts swirling in his mind. The woman he had seen, Emma, as she called herself, was Anna. He felt it in his bones, a certainty that defied logic and reason. Yet her denial, her insistence that he was mistaken, had left him questioning everything. Could grief have warped his memory? Had the years blurred the image of Anna in his mind, tricking him into believing in something that wasn't there? He barely slept that night. When he closed his eyes, memories of Anna flooded his mind, vivid and raw, as if no time had passed at all. He saw her standing at the edge of the lake, her hair catching the sunlight, her laughter carried on the breeze. He heard her voice, soft and teasing, as she called him out for taking life too seriously. And then he saw her in the storm, her face pale with fear as the boat rocked violently beneath them. The sound of her scream as the waves swallowed her whole was a haunting echo that had never left him. The next morning, Richard awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't let this go, not until he had answers. He returned to the diner, arriving just as the morning rush began. The place was bustling and Emma was there, moving between tables with the same quiet efficiency as the night before. He watched her from a corner booth, his heart pounding as he rehearsed what he would say. He needed to be careful, to approach her in a way that wouldn't scare her off. When she finally came to his table, her expression was guarded. "Back again?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with suspicion. Richard nodded. "The coffee was good," he said, forcing a smile. "But honestly, I came back to talk to you." She stiffened, the notepad in her hand lowering slightly. "I already told you," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not who you think I am." "I don't believe that," Richard said, leaning forward. "You look like her. You sound like her. There's no way it's a coincidence." Emma sighed, glancing around the diner as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then she leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "Look," she said quietly. "I don't know who you are or what you're trying to do, but I'm asking you to stop. I'm just a waitress trying to make a living. I don't need this kind of trouble." Richard studied her, searching for cracks in her facade. Her words were firm, but there was something in her eyes, an unspoken fear, a flicker of recognition, that betrayed her. He decided to change tactics. "If you're not Anna," he said, "then tell me about yourself. Where are you from? How long have you been here?" Emma hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "I've been here for a while," she said cautiously. "I moved here about 10 years ago. Before that, I lived in a few different places. Nothing interesting." Her vague response only fueled Richard's suspicion. "And before that?" he pressed. She straightened, her eyes flashing with irritation. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "Because I think you're lying," Richard said bluntly. "I think you're Anna, and I think you're hiding something." For a moment, Emma's composure cracked. Her eyes widened, and she took a small step back. But just as quickly, she recovered, her expression hardening. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice cold. Richard didn't argue. He could see that he had pushed too far, and he didn't want to risk driving her away completely. "I'm sorry," he said, standing and placing a $20 bill on the table. "I didn't mean to upset you. But I'm not giving up on this." As he left the diner, he felt a pang of guilt. Emma, or Anna, as he was convinced she was, clearly didn't want to be found. But he couldn't ignore the pull of the past, the possibility that the love of his life had somehow survived and was living right under his nose. Over the next few days, Richard began piecing together everything he could about Emma. He spoke to the other staff at the diner, carefully phrasing his questions so as not to raise suspicion. Most of them didn't know much about her. She kept to herself, they said, and never talked about her past. She was kind and hard-working, but there was a sadness about her, a weight she carried that no one dared to ask about. Richard also began visiting the diner at different times of the day, watching her from a distance as he tried to gather more clues. He noticed the way she avoided certain topics of conversation, the way she flinched when customers mentioned the lake that was just a few miles outside of town. He noticed the way she seemed to relax when she thought no one was watching, the faint trace of a smile that appeared when she listened to the jukebox in the corner. One evening, as the diner began to empty, Richard decided to try a different approach. He waited until the other customers had left, then approached Emma as she cleaned the counter. "I'm sorry for bothering you," he said, his tone soft and sincere. "But I just can't shake the feeling that I know you. And if there's even the slightest chance that you're Anna, I need to know. Please, just tell me the truth." Emma stopped wiping the counter, her hand frozen mid-motion. For a long moment, she said nothing, her back turned to him. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why can't you just leave it alone?" Richard's heart leapt. It wasn't a denial. "Because I can't," he said. "Because I've spent the last 23 years wondering what happened to the woman I loved. And now, seeing you here, I can't let it go. If you're Anna, I need to know. If you're not, I'll leave you alone. But I need the truth." Emma turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then help me understand," Richard pleaded. "Tell me what happened. Tell me why you disappeared." For a moment, it seemed as though she might finally open up. Her lips parted, and her eyes softened, as if the weight of her secret was too much to bear. But then, just as quickly, she closed herself off again. "I can't," she said firmly. "I'm sorry, but I can't." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen and leaving Richard standing there, his chest aching with frustration and heartache. As he drove home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer to the truth than ever. Emma was hiding something, of that he was certain. And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered it. What he didn't know was that Emma was watching him through the kitchen window, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched him leave, a storm of emotions swirling within her. She had spent years building a new life, hiding from the ghosts of her past. And now, those ghosts had found her. She knew she couldn't keep the truth buried forever. But the question that haunted her was whether revealing it would bring closure, or destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. Richard couldn't let it go. The encounter with Emma, or Anna, as he believed her to be, gnawed at his every waking moment. She had denied knowing him, but her reaction, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, told a different story. He had spent over 2 decades searching for closure, and now that he was so close, he couldn't simply walk away. He started with public records, hiring a private investigator to dig into Emma's background. The investigator, a grizzled man named Walter, had a knack for uncovering secrets. It wasn't long before he returned with a folder of documents, though what they revealed only deepened the mystery. Emma's trail began 10 years earlier when she had moved to this small town and taken up work at the diner. Before that, there was nothing, no birth certificate, no previous addresses, no employment history. It was as though she had appeared out of thin air. Richard stared at the folder, his frustration mounting. "There's got to be more," he said, pacing Walter's office. "She didn't just materialize out of nowhere." Walter leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette. "People can disappear if they want to," he said. "Change their name, wipe the slate clean. But it usually means they're running from something, or someone." That thought chilled Richard to the bone. What could Anna, if it was her, have been running from? And why hadn't she reached out to him? Desperate for answers, Richard decided to confront her again, though this time, he resolved to tread more carefully. He returned to the diner, timing his visit for the late evening when the place was quiet. He ordered a coffee and sat in his usual booth, waiting patiently for Emma to approach. When she finally did, he spoke gently, his tone devoid of the desperation that had driven their previous encounters. "Emma," he said, looking up at her. "I know I've been bothering you, and I'm sorry. But I can't shake the feeling that you're someone I used to know. If I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone. But if there's even the slightest chance that you're Anna, please, just tell me." Her expression was unreadable as she set the coffee down in front of him. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the table. Then, with a quiet sigh, she slid into the seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but steady. "Whoever you think I am, that person doesn't exist anymore." Richard's heart raced. It wasn't a denial, not entirely. "So, you are Anna," he said, leaning forward. "You're her." "I knew it." Emma shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "You think it's that simple?" she asked. "You think I can just say yes and everything will go back to the way it was?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But I need to know the truth. I need to understand why you disappeared. Why you let me think you were dead for all these years." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "It wasn't my choice," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to disappear. But I didn't have a choice. I had to protect you." "Protect me?" Richard repeated, his brow furrowing. "From what?" Emma hesitated, her gaze darting toward the kitchen as though she feared someone might overhear. Then she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father," she said. Richard felt as though the air had been knocked out of him. "My father?" he asked, incredulous. "What does he have to do with this?" Emma's hands clenched into fists. "He didn't approve of us," she said. "He thought I wasn't good enough for you. And when he couldn't convince you to end things, he made me disappear." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard stared at her, his mind racing. His father had always been a domineering presence in his life, but he had never imagined him capable of something so cruel. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did he do?" Emma closed her eyes, as though reliving the nightmare. "He threatened me," she said. "He said if I didn't leave, he would ruin me, and you. He had people follow me, harass me. And then, that weekend at the lake, the storm wasn't an accident." Richard's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" Emma opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. "I'm saying your father arranged it," she said. "The storm, the boat capsizing, it was all planned. He wanted me out of the picture, and he didn't care how it happened." Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had spent years mourning Anna, blaming himself for not being able to save her, and now he was learning that it had all been orchestrated by his own father. "But you survived," he said, his voice shaking. "How?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "After the boat capsized, I managed to grab onto some debris. I drifted for hours until I was picked up by a fishing boat. By the time I made it back to shore, I knew I couldn't go back. Your father would have made sure I disappeared for good. So, I ran. I changed my name, started over. It was the only way to stay safe, and to keep you safe." Richard's hands trembled as he tried to process what she was telling him. The woman he had loved, the woman he had mourned, had been forced into hiding by his own family. And all because they had dared to love each other. "I can't believe this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe he would do something like this." Emma reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. "I didn't want to leave you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you, Richard. I still do. But I couldn't let him destroy you. I thought it was better if you thought I was gone." Richard shook his head, his own tears threatening to spill over. "You should have told me," he said. "We could have fought him together. We could have figured something out." Emma's gaze dropped to the table. "I didn't think you'd believe me," she said. "And even if you did, he had too much power. I couldn't take that risk." The weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the anger and betrayal coursing through him. He couldn't ignore what his father had done, nor could he ignore the pain Emma, had endured because of it. "I'm going to fix this," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I don't know how, but I'm going to make it right. He's not going to get away with this." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Be careful," she said. "He's more dangerous than you realize." Richard nodded, his jaw set with determination. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to lose her again. Not this time. Richard left the diner that evening with a fire burning in his chest. Anna's, revelation had shaken him to his core. The man he had idolized, the father whose approval he had sought his entire life, was not the man he thought he was. His mind reeled as he tried to reconcile the memories of his father's stern but protective nature with the monstrous actions Emma had described. Could it be true? Could his father, a man of wealth and influence, have orchestrated something so vile? Deep down, Richard knew the answer. The patterns of control, the cold manipulation, his father had always been capable of darkness. But this was different. This wasn't just business ruthlessness or harsh parenting. This was a betrayal of the deepest kind, a calculated move to destroy a love that had meant everything to him. Richard knew he had to confront his father, no matter the cost. He needed answers, and he needed justice, not just for Emma but for himself. The next day, Richard drove to his father's sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. The mansion loomed ahead, a testament to his father's wealth and power, but to Richard, it felt cold and lifeless. As he walked up the marble steps, memories of his childhood flashed before him, his father's stern lectures, the quiet pressure to excel, the underlying message that love was a weakness. For years, Richard had buried his resentment, telling himself that his father's strictness had made him the man he was today. But now, those memories felt tainted, their edges sharp and painful. The butler answered the door, his face neutral as always. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellis," he said. "Your father is in the study." Richard nodded, his jaw clenched. He didn't wait for an escort, making his way through the familiar halls until he reached the heavy oak doors of the study. Without knocking, he pushed them open and stepped inside. His father, Gregory Ellis, sat behind a massive desk, a glass of scotch in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Richard," he said, setting the glass down. "This is a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Richard closed the door behind him, his eyes narrowing. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Gregory raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Richard took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "About Anna." For a brief moment, something flickered in Gregory's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Richard snapped, his voice rising. "I know what you did. I know you threatened her, harassed her, and forced her to disappear. I know you're the reason she's been hiding for the past 23 years. Gregory's expression hardened, the facade of indifference slipping. "Who told you that?" he asked, his tone cold. "It doesn't matter," Richard said. "What matters is that I know. I want to hear it from you. I want to know why." Gregory stood, his towering frame imposing as he stepped out from behind the desk. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You were a naive, lovesick boy, blinded by infatuation. She was a distraction, Richard. A liability. She would have ruined you." "Ruined me?" Richard repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "She loved me. And I loved her. She didn't deserve what you did to her. None of us did." Gregory's jaw tightened. "You think love is enough?" he spat. "You think it would have saved you from the consequences? I did what I had to do to protect you, to protect our family. You were too young and foolish to see it, but I saved your life." Richard shook his head, his anger boiling over. "You didn't save anything," he said. "You destroyed it. You destroyed her. Do you have any idea what you put her through? The fear, the pain, the years of hiding? You didn't just ruin her life, you ruined mine too." Gregory's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of decades of lies and manipulation pressing down on them both. "I'm done letting you control me," Richard said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You don't get to decide what's best for me anymore. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make things right with her, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Gregory's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think it's that simple?" he asked. "You think you can just waltz back into her life and pretend the past doesn't matter? You're a fool, Richard. You always have been." "Maybe I am," Richard said. "But I'd rather be a fool than the kind of man you are." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Richard thought his father might lash out. But Gregory said nothing, his face a mask of cold fury. Richard turned and walked out of the study, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He felt a strange mix of anger and Relief, the confrontation both cathartic and painful. He had stood up to his father, but the battle was far from over. As he drove away from the estate, his thoughts turned to Emma. He needed to tell her what had happened, to show her that he was on her side. But when he arrived at the diner later that evening, she was gone. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman with a bright smile, told him that Emma had taken the day off. Richard's heart sank. He had been so focused on confronting his father that he hadn't considered how his actions might affect Emma. Had she heard about his visit to Gregory? Was she afraid of what might happen next? The thought of losing her again was unbearable. He decided to wait, returning to the diner every day in the hopes of seeing her. When she finally appeared, her expression was guarded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Richard approached her cautiously, his heart pounding. "I talked to him," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I confronted my father." Emma's eyes widened, her breath catching. "And?" "He admitted it," Richard said. "Everything you told me. He doesn't even regret it. But I'm not going to let him win. I'm going to make this right." Emma looked away, her shoulders trembling. "You don't understand," she said. "He's not going to stop. If he knows I'm here." "I won't let him hurt you," Richard interrupted. "Not again. I promise you, Emma, I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. You don't have to hide anymore." For a long moment, she said nothing, her silence filled with the weight of years of pain and fear. But then she looked at him, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "I want to believe you," she said. "But I don't know if I can." "You don't have to decide right now," Richard said. "Just give me a chance to prove it. Let me show you that we can fight this together." Emma nodded slowly, her walls beginning to crack. It was a small victory, but for Richard, it was enough. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. He had lost her once, but he wouldn't lose her again. Not without a fight. The days following Richard's confrontation with his father were tumultuous, filled with a whirlwind of emotions, unexpected turns, and a quiet resolve that grew stronger with every passing hour. For the first time in years, Richard felt a clarity of purpose. He knew what he had to do, not only protect Emma but also ensure that the truth came to light. What his father had done couldn't be swept under the rug any longer. At the same time, Emma was battling her own storm of emotions. She had spent over 2 decades building a life of quiet anonymity, distancing herself from the pain of her past and the dangers it had once posed. Yet, in Richard's presence, the walls she had carefully constructed began to crumble. The man she had once loved, the man she thought she could never see again, was now standing before her, ready to fight for her. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Richard didn't waste time. He began assembling evidence of his father's misdeeds, starting with Emma's story and the sparse but telling details she could provide. While she had no direct proof of Gregory's involvement in the boat accident, her account of the threats and harassment she had endured painted a damning picture. Richard knew he would need more if he wanted to hold his father accountable. His private investigator, Walter, proved invaluable. Digging deeper into Gregory's past, Walter uncovered a pattern of behavior that was chilling. Gregory had used his wealth and influence to manipulate and intimidate others on more than one occasion, silencing anyone who threatened his carefully curated image. Former business rivals, employees, even family friends, there were whispers of coercion and underhanded tactics that painted a picture of a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But the most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Gregory's former assistant, a woman named Eleanor. Now retired and living in a modest home on the outskirts of the city, Eleanor had long harbored guilt over her complicity in Gregory's schemes. When Richard approached her, explaining everything he had learned, she hesitated but ultimately agreed to speak. "I didn't know everything," she said, her hands trembling as she poured tea for Richard and Walter. "But I knew enough." He told me to arrange for someone to handle the situation with your girlfriend. I didn't ask questions, but I knew it wasn't right. I've regretted it ever since." Her testimony, combined with the evidence Walter had gathered, began to form a compelling case. Richard knew it wouldn't be easy to bring his father to justice, but he was determined to try. At the same time, he focused on rebuilding the trust between himself and Emma. They spent hours talking, sharing memories of the past and dreams for the future. Slowly but surely, the distance between them began to shrink. But Gregory wasn't one to back down without a fight. Word of Richard's investigation reached him quickly, and he wasted no time in retaliating. Using his connections, he spread rumors about Richard's mental state, suggesting that his son was unhinged and obsessed with a woman who didn't exist. The whispers grew louder, and Richard found himself facing skepticism from people he had once considered allies. It wasn't just Richard who bore the brunt of Gregory's wrath. Emma, too, found herself targeted. Late one evening, as she was closing the diner, she noticed a black car parked across the street, its engine idling. The headlights cast an eerie glow, and the figure inside was obscured by darkness. A chill ran down her spine, memories of past threats flooding back. She hurried inside, locking the door and drawing the blinds, but the fear lingered. When she told Richard about the incident, he was furious. "He's trying to scare you," he said, pacing the small living room of Emma's modest apartment. "But I won't let him. I'll increase security, hire someone to watch the diner. You won't have to go through this alone." Emma nodded, her trust in Richard growing despite her lingering fears. "I don't want to live like this anymore," she said quietly. "I don't want to keep running." "You won't have to," Richard promised. "We'll face him together." The community began to take notice of the unfolding drama. Gregory's name, once spoken with reverence, now carried a hint of scandal. Rumors spread about his alleged actions, and while many were hesitant to believe them outright, others began to question the man they had once admired. Richard's decision to speak out, despite the personal cost, earned him both support and criticism. Some praised his courage, while others accused him of betraying his family. But Richard didn't care about the whispers. His focus was on Emma and ensuring that Gregory's actions didn't go unpunished. He enlisted the help of a lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Carla who had a reputation for taking on powerful adversaries. Together, they began building a case, using the evidence and testimonies they had gathered. The tipping point came when Eleanor, Gregory's former assistant, agreed to go public with her story. In a televised interview, she recounted her years working for Gregory, describing the fear and manipulation she had witnessed. Her account was a bombshell, sending shockwaves through the community and beyond. It was no longer just Richard's word against Gregory's, there was now a credible witness willing to back up his claims. The fallout was immediate. Gregory's business empire began to crumble as investors pulled out and partners distanced themselves. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now facing public scrutiny and legal challenges. For Richard, it was a bittersweet victory. He had succeeded in exposing his father's actions, but the cost had been high. Through it all, Emma remained by his side. Their relationship, once fractured by years of pain and separation, grew stronger as they faced each challenge together. Emma found herself rediscovering parts of herself she thought she had lost, the strength, the resilience, and the capacity to love without fear. The community's reaction was mixed. Some rallied around Richard and Emma, offering their support and admiration. Others clung to their loyalty to Gregory, unwilling to believe the accusations. But as more details emerged, the tide began to turn. The truth, as painful as it was, couldn't be ignored. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Emma began to envision a future together. They knew it wouldn't be easy, there were wounds that would take time to heal, and challenges they had yet to face. But for the first time in years, they felt a sense of hope. As they walked hand in hand through the town square one evening, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold, Emma turned to Richard with a soft smile. "Thank you," she said. "For fighting for me. For believing in me." Richard squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'll always fight for you," he said. "No matter what." The road ahead was uncertain, but together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The morning was still and quiet, the kind of calm that comes after a storm. Richard and Emma stood on the porch of her modest home, watching the sunrise cast its golden light over the town. It had been weeks since Gregory's downfall, weeks of public revelations, private battles, and tentative steps toward healing. Yet, as the world around them began to settle, Richard knew the real journey was only just beginning. The fallout from Gregory's actions had rippled far beyond their immediate circle. His business empire had crumbled under the weight of scandal, and while some of his allies had tried to defend him, the mounting evidence made it impossible to deny the truth. Gregory had gone into self-imposed exile, retreating to a private estate far from the public eye. For Richard, there was no satisfaction in his father's disgrace, only a hollow ache for the man he had once hoped Gregory could be. But it wasn't just Gregory's life that had been upended. The town, once dominated by his influence, was now grappling with the aftermath of his exposed corruption. People whispered in cafes, debated in town meetings, and re-evaluated their loyalties. Some reached out to Richard and Emma with words of support, while others avoided them entirely, unwilling or unable to confront the uncomfortable truth. For Emma, the transition was particularly jarring. After years of living in the shadows, she found herself thrust into the spotlight. Her story had captured the attention of the media, and while she had initially resisted the idea of going public, Richard had convinced her that sharing her truth could bring closure, not just for her, but for others who had suffered under Gregory's control. In a heartfelt interview, Emma recounted her journey, from the idyllic days of her relationship with Richard to the nightmare of being forced into hiding. She spoke of the threats, the fear, and the strength it had taken to rebuild her life. Her vulnerability struck a chord with viewers, and the response was overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from strangers who had been inspired by her resilience, and local organizations offered to help her transition into a new chapter of her life. But despite the outpouring of support, Emma struggled with the weight of her past. Some nights, she woke in a cold sweat, memories of Gregory's threats and the harrowing storm haunting her dreams. Other times, she felt a deep sense of guilt for the people she had left behind, for the life she had abandoned, and for the pain her disappearance had caused Richard. Richard, too, wrestled with his own demons. He had spent years idolizing his father, building his own success on the foundation Gregory had laid. To realize that foundation was built on lies and manipulation was a betrayal that cut deep. But he channeled his pain into action, using his resources to undo some of the damage Gregory had caused. He established a foundation in Emma's name, dedicated to supporting victims of abuse and coercion, and began working with local leaders to bring transparency and accountability to the town's institutions. As they worked to rebuild their lives, Richard and Emma grew closer, their bond deepening with each passing day. They spent hours talking about the future, dreaming of a life free from the shadows of the past. Richard sold his penthouse in the city and purchased a charming farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place where they could start anew. Together, they planted a garden, renovated the old barn, and began to envision the family they had once dreamed of. But their journey wasn't without its challenges. Gregory's influence lingered in subtle but insidious ways. Old friends distanced themselves, wary of the controversy surrounding Richard's name. Business deals fell through, and invitations to exclusive events dried up. Richard didn't care about the social consequences, but he worried about the impact on Emma. He hated the thought of her being ostracized for actions that weren't her fault. Emma, however, proved to be stronger than he had ever imagined. "I've spent too much of my life worrying about what other people think," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars. "I'm done hiding. This is our life now, and I'm not going to let anyone take it away from us." Her determination inspired Richard, and together, they began to build a new community of friends and allies, people who shared their values and supported their vision for the future. They hosted dinners at the farmhouse, inviting neighbors and local leaders to share stories, ideas, and laughter. Slowly but surely, they began to feel like they belonged. One day, as they worked in the garden, Emma paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I used to keep a journal. Back when I was in hiding. It was the only way I could make sense of everything." Richard looked up from the row of tomatoes he was planting. "A journal?" Emma nodded. "I wrote about everything, the fear, the loneliness, but also the hope. I wrote about you. About us." Richard's heart swelled at the thought. "Do you still have it?" "I do," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I've been thinking about publishing it. Maybe it could help someone else who's been through something similar." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Richard said, his voice filled with pride. "The world needs to hear your story." Emma's memoir, Lost and Found, A Journey of Love and Resilience, became an instant bestseller. Her words resonated with readers around the globe, and her courage inspired countless others to confront their own fears and embrace their truths. The book's success brought a new sense of purpose to Emma's life, and she began traveling to speak at events, sharing her story and advocating for change. Through it all, Richard remained by her side, their love a steady anchor in a sea of change. They knew their journey was far from over, but they faced each new challenge with a sense of hope and determination that had once seemed impossible. On the anniversary of their reunion, Richard and Emma stood on the porch of their farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Richard slipped his arm around Emma's waist, pulling her close. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice soft. "Every day," Emma said, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I wouldn't change a thing." Richard smiled, his heart full. "Neither would I." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, they stood together, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Their story, once marked by pain and loss, had become a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. And for the first time in years, they felt truly free.